fall on the topic of collective impact. And we've really tried to design this series so there was not a lot of overlap, so that if you like one of the webinars, you can perhaps go back and listen to some of the others that are available on our website as recorded webinars to continue to learn more about this very important topic. Today's topic is really about going from theory to practical action. In our agenda, we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways collective impact is different from the way traditional planning and working has occurred. And then we're going to focus on the 5 conditions, but focus on practical steps for being more successful in each of those. And then we'll wrap up with some time for questions and next steps. So the concept of collective impact has gained a lot of popularity since the articles that originally came out in the winter of 2011, and then I really like the second article that came out in the winter of 2012 on making collective impact work. And so it's really helped bring a lot of different organizations, funders, government programs, nonprofits, United Ways, hospitals, together with at least a framework and a foundation of language that can really be a significant improvement over the way things have been done over the last several years. If you're not familiar with the articles from the Stanford Social Innovation Review, the blogs, and other supporting articles, I definitely encourage you to check it out. And one of the places to get more resources is on a free site called Community Commons, which is www.communitycommons.org, and they have different hubs for different topics and information. And in the Collective Impact Hub, there's links to all of these articles, as well as other resources and white papers that you might want to consider. So I want to start off with our first poll here, just to get a sense for the audience in terms of your understanding of collective impact. And we've got 4 different choices here, from very little exposure beyond hearing the term to some limited exposure. Maybe it's a concept that you embrace or have a solid understanding of, or you'd consider yourself to be very familiar with collective impact, either from having studied it in depth or from working at putting it into practice. So I'm going to share the first poll here, and we will take that here, launch, and see if you can click which of those best describes your background, so we can have a little bit of a sense as we go through this. Okay, if everyone can just vote here in the next few seconds. Okay, last chance to vote. And all right, we'll close the poll and share the poll here. So it's interesting. We have 3 that are all at the same 19%, and then the 43% have limited exposure. So this webinar is not going to provide a lot of background on collective impact, but I certainly encourage you to look at the articles or some of the other webinars, to get some additional insights on it. But you will see that it's the framework that we're using to share some practicals for improved collaboration in communities. So in the first couple articles on collective impact, these 5 conditions of collective impact were identified. And these have really proven to be a useful way of thinking about how communities can make this shift from isolated impact, where individual organizations, individual programs are out there trying to solve problems and trying to prove to the funders that they are the ones that should be funded because they have the most effective solution. And instead realizing that these are complex issues that take many different organizations working as a team, and when they do that, they can achieve this enhanced effectiveness, which has been termed collective impact. And these 5 conditions are not they've proven to, again, be very useful in framing these discussions. The first is having a common agenda. The second is having shared measurement. The third, and I think this is the most powerful, is having mutually reinforcing activities, where different organizations aren't trying to do everything themselves, but they can recognize that that different organizations bring different strengths. They have different ways that they can play a role as part of a team, and together they can have a mutually reinforcing plan of action that makes them all more successful. And that's really the power behind this. The common agenda and the shared measurement largely are a means to achieving these mutually reinforcing activities, which I say is really the engine behind the improved results. To get there, it's also important to have continuous communication across the various players. And the most innovative term and concept that the collective impact movement has brought about is this concept of backbone support. And backbone support is really where you have not necessarily just an organization. There's been a gradual evolution away from the fact that this requires a separate organization to recognizing that you need to have backbone support provided in some way. And it can be distributed across different organizations in some circumstances, but there definitely needs to be an intentional focus of how do you coordinate and reinforce teamwork rather than everyone just working on their own individual programs and their own organizational strategies. So again, this sort of gives you conditions for collective impact, but it doesn't really explain how you get there. I think one of the first things to realize is that this involves some pretty significant shifts in thinking from what is fairly well established in most organizations. And organizations have a strong tendency of thinking about what they, as their organization, needs to do and what's their plan, how are they going to get their funding, how are they going to grow and succeed. And the shifting to is really thinking about how are we going to win as a community in addressing these complex issues. And it's in the context of that greater community strategy to think about then what is my organization's role as a team player. You know, in football, the offensive lineman doesn't score points by himself, but he's very important to the success of the team. And in any community, you have different organizations that can play different roles, and others can provide the assists, much like we think about in a sports team. Some people have referred to this as a Copernican shift in strategic thinking, and it shouldn't be underestimated. It involves a lot of different ways of thinking about things, that the universe doesn't revolve around your organization, but your strategy can revolve around the community. Another important shift in thinking to be intentional about is to shift from an evaluation, from a mindset that's driven by evaluation to a mindset that's driven by strategy execution and how are we going to get to the results. Since there's been such an emphasis on evaluation over the past 20 years or so, this has really shaped the way a lot of planning is done and the way measurement is done, and oftentimes it is a hindrance to actually getting things done, making adjustments and engaging others, and it tends to drive a focus on what can I control, what am I going to be responsible for, that can actually hinder effective collective impact. Now, if you measure and monitor things the way we recommend, it does serve evaluation purposes very well, but it's evaluation in the context of how are we going to execute and how are we going to engage others to work together. In the second article, there's this table on how collective impact can be achieved. And this is a good, again, general guideline that there are these various components for success, and they have different things that are focused on in the various phases. So initially, when you're trying to get things going, it's very valuable to identify the champions and form a cross-sector group that wants to do collective impact. And then, as far as planning, a first step tends to be looking at the data, looking at the environment of organizations and needs to make the case that, hey, we really do need to work together and we have some serious issues. And then it's very important to involve the community. It's not just about a couple of organizations. The more depth of community engagement you have, the better. And then identifying some baselines and gaps in issues is all part of the first phase. We're not going to go into the details of that as much as in today's webinar. We'll be talking primarily about ways of kind of practical steps in the second phase, where you're really defining your infrastructure. How are you going to manage the whole backbone support process? What processes are you going to use to engage and align and monitor progress? How do you create the common agenda? How do you define the goals? What structure do you use to organize the strategy? And how do you make sure you've got broad engagement and you're building that support? And then how do you manage, not only establish shared metrics, but also use them? So that'll be the lion's share of what we'll be talking about today, although some of what we talk about will also fit into some of the Phase 3 topics. So again, this is a very good structure, but it leaves a lot of questions. How do you go about doing this? And there's not one specific way. I don't think collective impact, is the mindset is that there's only one way of doing it. But what we will show you today is based on our experience of many years of working with community collaboration and community coordination efforts. So with that background, let's take a look at each of these 5 conditions and some practical steps. So the first thing we recommend when creating a common agenda is to start by getting the various stakeholders to agree on the concept of a common agenda. Before you start to say what is our agenda and what are we going to be doing, agree that it's better to have a shared agenda that you've co-created and that it's going to be a framework. That's better than everyone just doing separate things and then kind of going their own separate ways. Once you've agreed that you want to do this and that there's value in this, then you can begin going down that path with more of a consensus. So it's important that people realize that when you create this strategic framework, it's not a to-do list. So people shouldn't be saying, oh, everything that we start putting on here is stuff that I need to do. It's actually a structure to organize so that you can be more effective as a team and much more efficient in managing the information. Another thing to recognize up front is that it's not about one organization controlling another organization, but rather you're coming together as peers, and in doing this there's a lot of benefits. You can have much better communication, you can reduce the fragmentation and redundancy and waste, you can be more effective at collaborating and working together, which will save your organization money, and it will simplify your lives because you're not constantly reinventing the wheel or having to do things that could be better done by other organizations. Having this conceptual buy-in really helps when you move to the next steps. Then it's important to recognize that there are different drivers that different organizations have for coming to the table, different motivators and different concerns, and agree up front that you're going to look at those and you'll have to balance them. So for example, hospitals may say, well, we need to do a community health needs assessment every 3 years, and the health departments have to do it every 5 years, so therefore that doesn't work. Well, just acknowledge that you have different schedules, but there's a way you can do this that will meet both your needs. Sometimes, again, a health department will say, we're focused on the county, and the hospital is focused on their service area. They're not the same. Acknowledge that and find an approach that will meet both the needs. And look, there may be different financial motivators, different political pressures. Don't ignore them, but recognize that you can find common ground and commit to finding that common ground and mutual benefit and not letting the little obstacles divide you. And a key part of this is that everyone should come to the table saying we're working as peers. There's usually a steering committee as opposed to one organization that's running everything, which is why we tend to recommend distributed backbone support. And if you have a backbone organization, they should embrace the concept of servant leadership. They're not there to become the big, controller of all things, but rather their role in providing backbone support, if it is a separate organization, is to help others be more successful. And most of the authority should come from a steering committee where people are working as peers. Oftentimes communities will spend a lot of time defining a common goal, but as we show in this picture, having a common goal isn't enough. young kids playing soccer can have a common goal. They know what they're trying to do to score, but they're not working really as a team. It's a bunch of people out there each working independently, and that isn't that high performing. In contrast, when you get into more professional soccer or college soccer, they definitely are playing as a team. They know their roles, and it's much more effective. And what enables that is that they have a strategy. They know how they're going to each play their role as a part of working together. And that's typically what's missing in a community. And so for collective impact to be most effective, it's helpful to go beyond just saying, we're going to agree we want to have children reading at grade level by 3rd grade and have improve our high school graduation rates. Those are kind of your agreed upon goals and perhaps your measures, but really to have effective teamwork, you need to be thinking about a strategy that can harness the strengths of each organization in the community, and that it can be used to mobilize others to be part of the team and provide those valuable assists to help the community be successful. So this somewhat involves rethinking of the word strategy for some people. Many people have spent years thinking about strategy in terms of the organizational mindset of my organization's strategy, where the thinking is, oh, we can't spread ourselves too thin. We can't be all things to all people. We have to pick a few things that we will do with our limited resources. And being strategic means narrowly focusing. Well, when we're looking at strategy from a community mindset, it actually is more helpful to think of the strategy as a framework that will enable the alignment of many different organizations and that will enable your success. What is it going to take to actually overcome these big challenges? And then work as a community to figure out how you're going to do the things that make up that strategy. Oftentimes you don't have all the answers, but you can begin to develop a framework. Once you begin developing that framework that you believe will lead to success in whatever issue you're tackling, then you can work to align different organizations who may then pick 1 or 2 or 3 focused things that they will do, but their individual focus areas come together as part of a bigger plan with other mutually reinforcing activities. So a few tips. It is helpful to have you and your stakeholders embrace the concept of emergent strategy. And there's quite a few articles on this that are out in publications like the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And the idea is, when we're dealing with complex social issues and we're dealing with a lot of different stakeholders, different environments, different community assets that we might be able to mobilize, you don't have a very fixed, rigid strategy that you know if you just do A, B, and C, you will get D. But instead, there has to be some flexibility of learning and growing and evolving. Now, some people can get concerned that that's just sort of like asking funders for a blank check. And we'll actually be talking about that in our December 16th webinar, which is really geared towards funders. How you can balance having an emergent strategy but still have proven strategy management processes that create discipline and accountability, even though you're adjusting your strategy as you go through the journey. It's also important that you're not trying to just narrow down and focus. That's sort of a traditional way of looking at it, but you really want to look at how you can include more stakeholders and help them to co-create the strategy. It doesn't mean that you don't do any prioritizing, but you're really focused more on who can we bring to the table that will help this strategy be more successful. How do we bring their thinking, their knowledge, their passion to play whatever role can help. And so that creates the challenge of how do you manage all those moving pieces, and we'll talk more about that throughout the presentation. Another practice which we talked about a lot in our webinar earlier this month is structuring your strategy around OMTI, which stands for Objectives, Measures, Targets, and Initiatives. And in that webinar we went into some detail about how this is smarter than the typical SMART goal statements that say, you know, by such and such a date we will do such and such. And those often are not ideal for creating the alignment and the teamwork. And again, I won't repeat everything we did in that webinar, but we'll give you a little flavor of that as we go. Another tip that can be very helpful is articulating and describing your strategy in a set of zoomable visual display or that has a cause and effect structure. And we generally recommend using strategy maps, which you've probably seen if you've attended any of our other webinars. But it can also be done using a logic model, although we recommend a little bit of adjustments from the traditional static program logic model and have it a community logic model which is zoomable, which we again showed in detail in our last webinar, and I'll give you a little quick view of here shortly. What most organizations and communities tend to end up with after many months of working on a common strategy is a big document that's filled with tables such as this. And it has, you know, different SMART objectives that we talked about, and it has performance measures and sources and baselines. And most of this information is okay, but it's not structured in a way that really leads to effective execution. And so we'll show some better alternatives in the form of strategy maps or zoomable logic models that can be part of a structure to manage the implementation of that strategy or that common agenda. So when I show the example of a strategy map, and over the years we've really worked to simplify strategy maps. This is a very rich practice that has, you know, 20 or so years of history in the strategy management field. And the version that we are now recommending for community and collective impact efforts basically has three perspectives, or three ways to look at the strategy. What are the outcomes you're trying to achieve? What strategies are you going to implement? And there can be some multiple layers here, as we'll see. And then how are you going to mobilize and develop and harness your community assets so you'll be successful at the strategies and therefore achieve the outcomes? In these areas of the strategy map, these are called the strategic objectives. And in this case, we're looking at, in northern Colorado, it's Weld County, and we're looking at their strategy map for healthy eating. The outcome that they were working to have is to increase people living at a healthy body weight, and the outcomes that will help drive that are to decrease the consumption of sugary drinks and increase the consumption of healthy foods. And there can be some debate whether this pulls down into strategy or whether it's an intermediate outcome. And that's not a real huge issue. But there is this cause and effect logic that you begin to describe. In order to accomplish these outcomes, they had several strategic objectives, such as sustain and promote farmers markets and community gardens, or educate and promote healthy food and beverage choices, or improve nutrition in schools. To accomplish these, they had some other strategic objectives that we're going to show how they were going to improve these, such as collaborate to strengthen farmers markets and community gardens was a means by which they could sustain and promote farmers markets and community gardens, which would increase the consumption of healthier food. To do that, they had specific objectives to mobilize the community, such as building a strong coalition of diverse partners to support healthy eating and active living, or gathering and sharing data to improve prioritization and monitoring. These are things that they can measure and they can launch efforts to do to build their capacity to achieve everything up above. So this is a one-page summary of their strategy for healthy eating, but we'll see it's an interactive strategy. It's interactive in that we can click on these icons and zoom in, sort of like you would zoom in on Google Maps. So as we zoom in here, we're now looking at the details of educating and promoting healthy food and beverage choices. And we can now see some more detailed objectives. Just like when you zoom in on Google Maps, you might see more detailed roads when the more you zoom into a city. So they have specific objectives around promoting 5210 messaging or educating on healthy food and beverage choices or healthy food purchasing. Or they can add in details that weren't necessarily shown at the high level, but it allows other groups to be included rather than excluded just because they didn't fit into one of the top priorities. And this allows you to engage more of the community in an effective way on working on things that will help achieve your outcomes. We also have this icon that lets us zoom back up, and if we pick another area like healthy nutrition and improved nutrition in schools, we can zoom in to see the details there as well, where they have things like healthy food in vending machines or garden to cafeteria or healthier school menus. Now, to achieve the outcomes in a community, you often need people working on all of these issues. And in a community, you may have hundreds of efforts going on. A strategy map like this, with this ability to zoom in, helps those organizations stay organized, and it helps you then pull in others and monitor and manage your progress on each of these much more effectively than trying to use a big static document. Now, if we look at this, just one of the key aspects, I'm just focusing in here on a subset of this, is that a strategy map should allow you to really discuss the strategy in terms of how and why questions. So this is a practical tip to make these strategy maps really solid. If you look at an objective, in this case, expand farm-to-school programs and participants, and say, why are we doing that? You can look up, well, we want to improve nutrition in schools for these reasons. If you say, how are we going to do that? You can say, well, we're going to increase the partnerships with Real Food Colorado or strengthen the Weld Farm-to-School Purchasing Coalition. And these are more specific things that are driving the logic up. So a structure like this can help a community with many different organizations work much more effectively as a team. We recently presented on this specific county and their use of the strategy maps and the shared measurement system at the Public Health in the Rockies conference. And in that conference, Dr. Mark Wallace, who is the CEO of the North Colorado Health Alliance as well as the leader of the Weld County Health Department, said that in North Colorado it used to be like people having discussions in a crowded restaurant. They were talking about health, but it sort of ended up being a lot of noise. But now the health department, the hospitals, the United Way, the YMCA, the other organizations are all using the same strategy map framework. They're using the same language, and they're talking about how their role fits into this strategy. So he said now it's like being in a theater with surround sound. And so it may look like there's a lot of work in putting those strategy maps together, but when you think of the power of getting many different organizations on the same page and not having to continuously go back and rehash issues, the benefits are tremendous. I'm not going to go into the detail, but here was an example we showed for those that like logic models. Here's an interactive logic model showing it in our InsightVision strategy management system, where we can have the impacts, the long-term outcomes, the intermediate outcomes, and then the various activities and outputs and such, as many of you may be familiar with logic models. But again, with a technology-enabled logic model, you can click and zoom in to get more detail and show that next level of detail. You can have different logic models. You can show, how are we going to increase active living? Let's get more specific, like increasing active transportation or complete streets. And within our InsightVision strategy management platform, you can click on any one of these and get more detail, such as what are the various objectives of our complete streets effort. And one of those may be, increase mass transit with, or integrate mass transit with biking and walking. So you can start with very high-level issues like we want to reduce chronic disease, and then get down to things that are much more actionable and have measures and projects or initiatives that fit into a much bigger strategy. Clicking on any of those will bring up details. In our software we can have different tabs with different information that can be customized. Here's where we can begin to have information that we can easily edit and measures that we can monitor progress on. The structure behind this is very important, and again, we did a whole webinar that focused on this, but I wanted to just briefly mention how we structure in terms, we recommend structuring your strategy in terms of objectives, measures, targets, and initiatives. The objective is going to typically describe the change that you're desiring to have, and it doesn't include all of the aspects of a SMART objective. Trust me, they're all there, and they're actually smarter than those typical statements you see. But you start by just describing the change. And oftentimes we'll put a from-to gap that helps describe what you're really trying to change, and then we will measure how this change is going to be accomplished so you can monitor progress. And that might be something like % of employees who frequently bike or walk to work. That is going to have a trend of data points as well as a trend of targets going into the future so you know what you're trying to achieve, not just an end date. By 2020 we will do such and such, but something you can really monitor along the process. And often you have red, yellow, or green color bands, so you have a visual indicator of how you're doing with that measure. Then you don't do objectives and you don't do measures. What you do are initiatives or activities or projects. And these are where different organizations identify the work that needs to be done. Here you have start dates and end dates, something like conduct biking and walking audits to prioritize upgrades or distribute promotional material to employers. These you can actually measure by % complete. You can have, again, start dates and end dates, and here's where different organizations should be held accountable for doing their piece that they're committing to. So the objectives are really about aligning and understanding the change, and they usually start off with objectives that require many organizations working together. The measures are for monitoring, and then you describe specific initiatives or activities for delegating and for holding organizations accountable for doing their piece of the overall game plan. So this objectives, measures, targets, and initiatives has really been proven over 20 years as an excellent way to structure a strategy to get it executed. Now some of you might be saying, well, how exactly do you create these strategy maps? That looks like a pretty big job. And there's a lot of different ways of doing it. Oftentimes we help organizations do it through a series of web conference calls. In other cases we do it in live workshops. These are some pictures of some different strategy map sessions that we have worked on, where we took a lot of documents that had come out of previous meetings and plans, and we kind of chunked it down into some of the different concepts of what they wanted to do, and then worked with the group to sort of cluster them and then kind of name each cluster. Sometimes we'll use a sticky wall if we're facilitating a live group to bring a consensus. But the key is that you work so that everyone says, yeah, this is a strategy that we created as a community, and I'm working on maybe a little piece of it, but I recognize there's a bigger strategy here. And so we can then refine some of the wording. And in some cases we'll have a follow-up meeting, sometimes even on the same day, where the details of those objectives can be filled out. And that can be done if you have a person at each table with a laptop. You can actually fill that out right in an online tool, which can greatly simplify things. So we've got another poll question here. We spent quite a bit of time looking at this concept of zoomable strategy maps or zoomable logic models and using that as a structure for a common agenda to help achieve collective impact. So as you think about this, this kind of cluster of techniques and tools, how valuable do you think this would be to improve your collective impact efforts? So let me select the poll and launch it. And you can begin filling in Give a couple more seconds for people to fill in their poll.
Bill, while people are filling in the poll,
okay.
I wanted to mention that one of the questions that have come through is about learning more about the OMTI statements and how to improve upon those. And after today's presentation, Bill, there will be a survey, and we can include your ebook if you wanted to expand upon that. I think that really could be helpful.
Yeah, we have a document, I guess, that's grown into an ebook on some of the techniques that has a section on the OMTI, as well as the last webinar that we did has more detail, and there's a recording of that that's available as well. And if you're interested and would like to have a discussion, we could maybe, if you have some of the content you're doing, we could show you, sometimes just on the fly, showing people how it can be restructured. It creates a real aha moment. I know that the 5 years or many years, more than 5, probably the last 15 years of funders telling you need to have smart objectives has really driven everyone towards structuring things in that manner. But when it comes to collective impact and trying to work collaboratively and strategy execution, it's really not nearly as valuable as this practice that has been much more effective in other areas of strategy execution, which is now, I think, increasingly being recognized as a better alternative. Okay, so I will share the poll here. Close the poll, and we will share the results. And the majority, 61% of you, see that there's some value here in the strategy mapping or zoomable logic models that you should seriously consider. The others were kind of spread. Quite a few of you thought it was too complex to attempt. And I think, again, if you're not familiar with the concept, it can look pretty daunting. We typically will start with just that top layer of the strategy, and then when people get comfortable with that, we can then start to zoom in and say, okay, you've said you want to improve nutrition in schools. That's a little bit too big for anyone to bite off. It's simple, but it's not very actionable, so you can tend to stall out. So by breaking that down into some next level of details, it actually makes it easier to move forward on execution because you've broken it down into more pieces. Okay. So we will hide the poll. Great. And so that's we spent the majority of time on the common agenda. We'll move more quickly through some of the others, but let's talk about some practical tips for shared measurement. For shared measurement, again, we encourage people to think about some different questions. A question that people are often asking, and this is based on the isolated impact evaluation mindset, is how can I get data to demonstrate that my program is responsible for achieving the outcomes? And that's sort of assuming that you're looking for the silver bullet as opposed to the collective impact mindset that says, hey, no one program is responsible. It takes many of them working together. And similarly, the focus on how is it going to be measurable, how is it going to be measurable, often gets, I think, a mindset towards measurement that is not ideal for execution and collective impact. So think about these different questions. How can we use measures as a catalyst for collaboration? Or how can we work together to make measurement more effective and efficient as a community? The questions up above often has everyone hoarding data and measuring things differently and trying to find measures where they look good, as opposed to measures that are going to really lead to community effectiveness. Or which measures are most valuable for learning and for adjusting our efforts? This is often called the developmental evaluation in terms of this type of question. So let's look at an example. This happens to be part of a scorecard in the InsightVision software, which is our software platform, and this is again within Weld County. I'm not going to go into all of these measures, but they wanted to sustain and promote farmers markets and community gardens. So they had some measures such as the number of farmers markets in Weld County. And notice they didn't want that to increase because they felt that they already had enough. They just wanted the existing farmers markets to be successful. They had some new measures that they put in, like the sales through their double value coupons at the Greeley Farmers Market, where they didn't have, it was a brand new measure. So the first year data, they were just really establishing their benchmark. So they put their target at whatever the first year data was, but now they know going forward they have something to try to improve from. One of the important measures here was the dollars of vendor sales at the Greeley Farmers Market. And this is one where I think we can see the value of how they measured it. Now, in a typical evaluation mindset, the question would be, is the farmers market being successful? And are they having an impact on the health of the community? In this case, they began to think about it differently starting last year. Whereas they embraced collective impact, they realized a successful farmers market was something that the entire community was valuing. It was an important part of their strategy. And putting this measurement out there gave them the alarming news that sales had been declining for 4 years. And if that continued, their farmers market might fail and the community would then be worse off. So instead of seeing this as a measure to determine how successful was the farmers market, they said this is something we need to work on as a community to begin to turn this. And as they began to look at how they could rally around their farmers market, they were able to shift that and get that moving in the right direction. And we hope next year as we do more and more collective impact that it'll continue to go up. So the measure was thought about differently, and it was a catalyst for change, and it drove collaboration that's now resulting in a healthier farmers market, which means more access to fruits and vegetables, more fruits and vegetables being purchased, and so on. Now, another thing that they're doing in Weld County is that they're having the measures available through public websites, and this happens to be a website called MakeTodayCount.org. And on that home page, there's a link to go to their Thriving Weld data dashboard. Clicking here brings up a menu of different dashboards for each of their priority health issues as well as for their community partner categories. And if we click on any one of these, they can first see the strategy map. Again, this was crafted by many different stakeholders, so it's not just the health department strategy map, it's also the hospital strategy map or the United Way, because they've agreed to this as a community. And if we scroll down, we have interactive measures that people can see. They can see the status, they can click on them and see the trend, they can see the data, they can drill out to other data sources and download data. So it really has people saying this is a community measurement system. It's shared, and it's not a matter of each organization creating a report for their funders that nobody else sees, that pulls together numbers, that is really focused on helping them look good and get their funding renewed. This is saying, nope, this is our community data that we're all working on. And different community partners have their own scorecards that show their contribution. By clicking in here, we can see the different healthcare providers, see the objectives and measures that they're focusing on. So it's a powerful way to not just have shared measures, but a shared measurement system. A few techniques here. If different organizations have a dynamic scorecard built into their own website, but it's coming out of a shared system, that can be very valuable. It makes their life easier because it stays current, and when they need to update data, they don't just put it in their website and then they're too busy to go share it with anyone else. You make it easy for them to update it in this centralized system, and then it updates for anyone in the system that cares about that measure, or you can even aggregate measures from different organizations. It's also valuable if you can work with the funders in the community and get them to agree that instead of requiring a separate measurement system and a separate reporting requirement for each grant, and then people feel pulled in so many directions, and you have all this fragmented and inconsistent data, have them agree we should use the shared measurement system. And in Weld County, the Weld County United Way took that stance. They said they want their funding to support the community strategy. So therefore, they're going to be organizing their grant giving around the strategy maps. And when their grantees are reporting results, they should be reporting that in the InsightVision shared measurement system so that the information is shared and it can be used by the community to learn how are they doing, are they moving their community measures in the right direction, and if not, what can they do to improve their success. It's not about just judging individual programs, but how can they work together to achieve the desired outcomes. So again, it ends up really simplifying things, and it helps align the efforts in a much greater way, because now the funders are using the shared measurement system as well. The third condition is mutually reinforcing activities. And here it's recognizing that success is going to take a lot of different things working together. And that mindset is an important shift, and that's really the power source for collective impact. And one way to do that is that you begin defining objectives at the top level that no one organization can do, and use that to discuss how can we work together to accomplish things together that we couldn't do individually. And then a very valuable technique is to do what we call rapid cycle quality improvement. As you look in a monthly or quarterly basis, you say, what are we doing, how can we do it better, and most importantly, what other organizations in the community can we draw in to help provide assists, to help do it better. One of my favorite, and when you do that, you're expanding beyond sort of the typical mindset around evidence-based practices. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't care about evidence or that we'll do anything, we're not worried whether it works or not, but it recognizes that what are the so-called evidence-based practices are often things where you had usually you had somebody who had a financial interest in promoting a program, and they funded a research of an isolated program in very specific conditions. And if those are the only things you're willing to do, number one, they're typically expensive. Number two, they don't leverage your community partners very well, because those tend to be different from community to community, so they don't fit well into the kind of research protocols that universities tend to do when they do research for evidence-based practices. So you want to think beyond that and look at what kind of innovations can help strengthen things we're already doing in the community. And my favorite example is a group in Waconia, Minnesota, where a group of mothers were creating a program to help young girls in grades 3 through 6 navigate through those turbulent times of puberty and whatnot for young girls. And they put together a program that over a couple years evolved into a 10-week program with different speakers that would come and talk to these girls, and some mentoring, creating a real safe environment for them to talk about a lot of sensitive topics. And they introduced a fitness component. And part of that was that over the 10 weeks they would train, and at the end they would run a 5K. Well, one of the things they looked at is how can the community support the effort, this important transition effort for the girls, as knowing that this might help reduce teenage suicides, teenage pregnancy, and other problems that they had seen in their community. Well, one of the organizations that got involved was the area nursing home. These girls in their training would go running by the nursing home, and so the seniors there became sort of their cheerleaders. And they built a little bit more of the relationship, they got to know them, and by the time they ran their 5K, the cheerleaders from the nursing home were out there in their wheelchairs banging on pots with spoons, holding up signs, cheering on these young girls, and it was super inspiring for the girls. And it was an example of finding ways to take programs and engage the community to make them better. And in the webinar that I do on December 9th, we'll be showing a whole bunch of examples of mutually reinforcing activities that are helping us break the cycle of poverty and poor health in Detroit. So we definitely invite you to come to that webinar. So a quick poll question here. how would you rate your coalition's level of success in having differentiated, mutually reinforcing activities? We have poor, fair, good, very good, or NA if you're not part of a collective impact coalition. We'll select that poll, launch it, and you can pick which best describes your community's effectiveness in having differentiated, mutually reinforcing activities. We have a few seconds more to get people to vote. And we'll close the polls. Share the results here. So there was only 6% of you that felt you were very good at it. A little over 28% were both split between good, that you actually support collaboration and you work as a team, which is great, and fair, where you're making some progress in community teamwork. Well, there's a lot of techniques that can be done, and the process of going through the strategy mapping process and then bringing groups together and saying, how can we do things where we're not the entire solution, but we're a piece of it, and who else can we bring to the table to make it more successful, can really help generate momentum in communities pursuing collective impact. Okay, next, continuous communication. And clearly this is an important element if you're going to be achieving collective impact, but the question is, how do you do it? You know, what oftentimes happens is you have meeting after meeting after meeting, and you're gathering information, good content, you're updating the status, but the problem is some people are missing a meeting, and before long you often spend a lot of time trying to bring people up to speed, sharing what's going on, and the more things you have going on, the more burdensome these meetings become, and the less they become about forward progress and more struggling to not be overwhelmed with all the things that are going on. A question also happens when you have those meetings, you have discussions, what happens to all that content? How much of it really gets meaningfully moved forward into action? And oftentimes it ends up in big documents. So continuous communication is important, but the question is, how do you do it? We've shown some examples through this webinar of some of the techniques of using an online strategy management system, creating a structure that you can continuously build on, having measures available online, things that can shift the communication burden so that it's being borne by a technology platform, so people and meetings can be much more productive and effective. So we're getting near the end. I'm actually going to skip this poll just for time's sake so we can wrap up on time and just go to our last topic on backbone support. So throughout this, I've been kind of touching on some examples of using digital backbone technology or a software platform that helps strengthen that backbone function. And there's several benefits of this. One is that when you're not relying on staff in an organization to do the backbone support function, but you have a technology platform that can be used by multiple organizations, it makes it easier to distribute that backbone function among different organizations. So there's not this jockeying for who's going to be the backbone organization or getting multiple competing collective impact efforts. They can work together, and the value and the resources that go into hiring staff doesn't go into one organization, but yet you can still be working together effectively. Also, it allows funders to make a single investment that can benefit multiple causes. Instead of saying, do we need to fund a backbone organization that will hire staff for education, or do we have to choose health or economic development or environmental issues? They can provide the infrastructure that can be used by all of them. And in fact, the more collective impact topics that are addressed using a shared infrastructure, the more comfortable people get with that technology, and therefore everyone benefits. And it's also far more cost effective for managing information and communication than just trying to hire staff. Different subgroups can have 24/7 access to update information. You can have people working in small groups between meetings, and everyone can monitor that progress and access that information. You can have different groups that are working in parallel, but a digital platform can provide templates that creates a consistent format for how the information is managed and updated and built out. And when you have meetings, you don't have to spend all this time creating reports and building presentations for each meeting, so you have a much faster pace without all the work that goes into preparing for meetings, and people can keep things moving much more between meetings. So I think there's a lot of benefits here. One way, and this is our last slide, of looking at those benefits is to say, in a typical community that's trying to address an issue like chronic disease or educational success of their youth, there can be an awful lot of effort that goes into things that are indirect, where they're not really advancing that issue, where they're having meetings and they're designing measuring plans and they're creating reports and programs, ramping up and ramping down and ramping up and down their infrastructure. And this is just a rough estimate, but perhaps only 20% is actual work that's advancing that particular issue. Well, this is largely about information management and communication. And so by using technology, we think that it's reasonable that that slice can be cut in half just by making it more efficient. And if this is your resource pie, suddenly your slice of pie that's devoted to getting stuff done and engaging and working at advancing the issue is 3 times as much, even though you have the same amount of resources. But if you have that greater efficiency, the odds are the resource pie would grow because you would be able to attract and manage more partners who bring in their own resources. You'd be more successful at fundraising and getting grants because people would see that you've really got your act together and you're very efficient at coordinating and managing and measuring and monitoring progress. And you can tap into assets that might otherwise be too fragmented to harness. Volunteers, faith communities that collectively can do a lot if you have an efficient way of organizing them. And having some of the digital backbone can enable that. So it allows your work and resources on positive progress to go from a small slice in a small pie to a much bigger slice of a much bigger pie. And that can allow communities to really have breakthrough results. So that pretty much took us through our hour. We certainly are open. We can stick around if you have questions. You can type them in and we'll do our best to answer them either live, or we can do them via email or via a follow-on document that we can send out. So why don't we take a moment. Again, if there's any questions, you can type them into your questions section of your control panel. Liz, do you see any other questions here?
Well, I wanted to mention, Bill, that a survey will be delivered via email to all the participants today. And by filling out that survey, they'll be able to select to receive a copy of your ebook and receive a link to the recorded version of this that can be delivered via email once we upload it and different things. So I want to encourage everyone to fill that out and take advantage of the resources that they can select from. And there were a couple questions today about, I believe, some resources, but I think we've pretty much covered those, and they'll be available, including the PowerPoint slide set that you used during today's presentation too, Bill.
Yeah, there's a question about the cost of the resources. There's different ways. You can start by doing strategy maps and logic models just by using PowerPoint. And with a little creativity, you can make those so you can zoom in or zoom out. But the real power comes when that is enabled by a digital backbone platform. And InsightVision can be licensed in a variety of ways with different price points based on the number of users and whether you choose to rent or buy. And if you're interested, we'd be happy to talk with you about the different options for that. So our goal was to share a variety of techniques and tools today that can help you on going from the theory of collective impact to practical steps. And we certainly would be happy to talk with you further about how we may support you on that journey and how you may take advantage of these and other tools. So we thank you for your time, and I look forward to further discussion, and again encourage you to take a look at some of the other webinars in this series if this is your first one and you found this interesting and valuable information. Thank you very much.